Okay, so what we've done now up to this point is we talked about the aggregate expenditure model in general. That was in part 1. In part 2 we looked at the individual components, C, I, G, and NX. And now what we want to do is graph things out. Now, you saw that in part 1, I actually gave you a preview of this already because I often find it's, I'm not trying to do, a murder mystery novel here. You shouldn't have to wait to find out, what we're going to do here. So, essentially what happens here, the reason why we drew out the Keynesian cross the way that we did, right? So, the way that it looked, oh god, this thing looks horrible, but it's supposed to be a straight line here, and a straight line here, right? Is that first we drew the 45-degree line, because we knew that all points of equilibrium would have to be on that 45-degree line. Okay, now, with that said, if we just drew consumption, it would be right here. And now we knew that because if you remember from the previous part of this video, we said that consumption would look like, I think I had like 800 plus 0.75 y minus t. Right? So as income goes up, right, it's increasing by 0.75. So that would be the slope of this would be 0.75 for 1. So as income goes up by 1, consumption goes up by 0.75. So that's the slope of the consumption function, is the marginal propensity to consume. This part right here. Okay. Now we add to that investment, government expenditures, and net exports. Fortunately, all of those are considered exogenous or fixed, and they're not at all related to income levels. So we basically just shifted up by investment, shifted up by government expenditures, and then shifted up by net exports. Because essentially what is going on here on the side here is that investment is fixed, government expenditures are fixed, net exports are fixed, and their height is basically the vertical distance here. The only thing that's giving any of these curves the slope is that MPC. Okay, so with that, I'm just going to try to clean this up a little bit here. Let's go back to our original graph from part 1. My AE equals real GDP, and my AE curve equaling C plus I plus G plus NX. Okay, here's my equilibrium again. Right there. Now, right, what we see here, we have our unplanned decrease in inventories. Unplanned decrease in inventories. Here, we've got an unplanned increase in inventories. The reaction to an unplanned decrease in inventories is that you start to increase production to replenish your inventories. On this side, the unplanned increase in inventories, you react to that by decreasing how much stuff you have, how much production you have. Okay, at this point right here, that would be called the natural real GDP. And it has associated with it the natural unemployment rate, which you might remember from one of the previous chapters. So at this point right here, this real GDP, let's call it real GDP star. That's the natural GDP. It's also, what's associated with it is the natural rate of unemployment. To the left of that, you would be below potential GDP, and you would have higher unemployment, some positive cyclical unemployment. On this side right here, you would have negative cyclical unemployment, and you would have an economic boom period. Okay, now let's make sure here. So now what we want to then do is talk about what change, if we were to change something within the economy, how would that, let's say we have changed consumption or changed government spending, something like that. How does that affect things in terms of the Keynesian cross? To do that, we're going to actually have to look at something called the multiplier. Now, what the multiplier is essentially going to do here is it's going to do the following. The multiplier is going to equal the change, so triangle means change, the change in the equilibrium real GDP when you change one of the components of the aggregate expenditures, and that's going to be equal to 1 over 1 minus MPC. Essentially what we're doing here, so that you understand this graphically first, I'll make this a very crude graph. Here's my AE curve. Let's say that I spend more money and I'm the government. That's going to shift this up more, correct? Because government spending is now higher than it used to be. Notice what happened here is that the real GDP increased. Okay, well then the question is how much did I change government expenditures by, and how much did that change real GDP by? To get that answer of how much I changed this and how much I changed that, that's the two of these, right? This one is right here. This one is right here. To get that amount, I do 1 over 1 minus MPC. If we use the same example we had before, that would be equal to 1 over 1 minus 0.75. We would see that the multiplier is 4. Now that would be useful for us because that would give us a way to then say if I want to move the economy by, let's say, $100 billion, well, I only have to change this by 1/4 of that. Right? So if there's a $100 billion gap here, I only need to increase government spending by $25 billion to get a $100 billion change. Now, essentially then, the larger the marginal propensity to consume, the larger the multiplier would be. Now, the final part of this graph here that we want to do is we actually want to derive the aggregate demand curve. Just to keep things compartmentalized, I'm going to stop the video here. In the last video, I will do that last part of deriving the aggregate demand curve from the Keynesian cross.